Hello, everyone, and welcome to Facebook Live with the Horticulturists. We are the Horticulturists here to answer your gardening questions, and we have a special guest with us today that's going to talk specifically about invasive species. So if you have questions about invasive species in your own backyard or any type of gardening question, you can start to add those into the comment box, and we're going to address those today. My specialty tends to be kind of cut flowers, annuals, and perennials in the landscape, but my other horticulturists tend to like to talk about other things. So you guys want to introduce yourselves today?
Hi, my name is Kelly Allsup, and I am a horticulture educator based out of Bloomington. I love talking about insects and pollinators, and my background is in integrated pest management in a greenhouse setting. And then I like to dabble in vegetable gardening. I wouldn't call myself an expert, but if you can eat it, I've probably tried to grow it.
And I'm Ryan Pankau, horticulture educator out of Champaign County. And my specialty is probably woody plants, trees, and native plants I love. And then like Kelly, I also am a vegetable gardener, not an expert, but I definitely like to grow a lot of those plants and eat them. So, and then I'll send it to our special guest today.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. So I'm Chris Evans. I'm an extension forestry and research specialist here with the university. I'm based in Southern Illinois down at the Dixon Springs Agricultural Center. And so I specialize in invasive plant issues, forest management, forest health, all those things, both for programming and for research.
Excellent. Well, do you want to kick us off and start our conversation on kind of invasive species today, Chris?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's important to kind of start with just what is an invasive species. You get that question a lot, and it differs. A lot of people will say, a weed and invasive species, and those terms are a little different. To me, a weed is just a plant that's out of place, a plant that's not growing where you want it to be. So in that setting, even an oak tree might be a weed if it's growing in your flower garden. Mm-hmm. Invasive plants are a little different. These are non-native species that are not naturally found in that ecosystem. And then now that they're there, they're causing some kind of damage. And it could be ecological damage or environmental damage, some kind of negative consequence of them being on the landscape. And so those are the ones that are, to me, of most concern.
And today, so we're focusing on plants, but this spreads all across all the flora and fauna.
Yeah, absolutely. We have invasive species. The big one that everybody knows now is the Asian carp, right? So the silver carp jumping in our lakes, or emerald ash borer, which is an invasive insect that's impacting our trees. We even have feral hogs here in Illinois. So yeah, absolutely. They can be across the taxonomic range.
Excellent. So I think you had a couple of kind of top invasive species that you tend to deal with, right?
Yeah, so I kind of thought about this and tried to figure out what I think is the big three invasive plants in forest. And so since I'm a forester, that's where I focus on. And I actually did a little show and tell here. We got some.
Excellent.
The big one to me, the biggest one across Illinois, if we can see it. Oh, it's not. There we go. This is bush honeysuckle. So bush honeysuckle to me is our most damaging invasive plant in our forest. This is just a clipping right here, and it's a little past bloom, but it's a big shrub, 10, 15 feet tall. They are very heavy shade casters, and it has what we call an extended phenology, where it leaves out 2 weeks earlier or so than our native shrubs and stays green 3 or so weeks later. And it just, by doing that, it basically can help push out our native plants. We see a lot of reduction in diversity when this gets in here, impacts to our trees, to our wildlife as well. So this, to me, is the worst invasive plant we have across the state.
Yeah, I agree. And I think most people would notice this right now. We were, before this show, we were talking a little bit about kind of plant blindness and people not noticing plants. But once you realize what bush honeysuckle looks like, and with those white flowers and the red berries that come later, you start to look at any forested setting and you realize, wow, how much of that really is growing in the state.
Yep. especially in those few weeks when it's green and nothing else is, right? So early spring or kind of right around deer season, mid-November, it's usually the only green thing in the woods. So you can see it from a mile away, and it's astounding once you kind of start to be able to identify it and you lose that blindness. You see how much is out there. Sure.
Yeah. It's great.
Yeah, that's some harsh reality when you see it everywhere, from the woodlands you drive around in to the neighbor's edge of their yard to, I mean, it's not just in natural ecosystems that this plant occurs. It's everywhere. So
yes.
What makes it so bad?
Yeah, exactly. Its ability to just spread around and birds move it around. And yeah, it's you're right. It's surprising just how widespread it is.
It is.
The second
one.
Yeah, the second one that is also visible right now is our friend garlic mustard here. So garlic mustard, again, across the state. This one's a little different than the bush honeysuckle and kind of how it does its damage. You can see this one is past flowering, but we've got all the seeds all over it. So this plant, to me, is very damaging, particularly to our understory flora in our forest. So it leaves out, it grows pretty early. It's a biennial, so it has a 2-year life cycle. This is a 2nd-year plant here, and it's flowered and already producing seed. And it basically does that really early, and it can impact our spring wildflowers, our flowering trilliums and all those in our forest. And so it's really kind of impacting that layer of the forest. And we're finding that it's not like deer or other animals don't eat it. And so when you get it in a forest, it hurts the wildlife value that way as well.
And it produces a lot of seeds, right? I can see the seed pods starting on those.
Yeah, we did a little study on this one earlier, looking at some control methods. And we found that one plant can produce over 1,000 seeds. And then they're pretty stacked in there. So per square meter or whatever, you can have tens of thousands of seeds.
Yeah.
One of the surprising things that I've seen about garlic mustard is that I can find it in sun, I can find it in shade, I can find it anywhere, any kind of soil. It just really adapts. And then walking around my neighborhood, I've seen garlic mustard everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Even in your flower gardens, it can really adapt well and spread. It actually was started out as a like an herb plant. People would grow it to eat it because it isn't bad tasting. I've had it before. And that's why it was brought over and planted and kept kind of in your garden there. And then it moved out from that.
Yeah, I've seen people make pestos with it when they're pulling it.
Yep. My favorite is like a dipping sauce for morel mushrooms. You mix it in with some sour cream. It's not too bad.
Nice. Well, at least it has some use, I guess.
That's right.
Well, and also one that's very recognizable when it flowers, and here in central Illinois, it's probably still kind of flowering a little bit. Further south, it's already done its thing. I'll bet northern Illinois, it's very visible right now, but it really sticks out to me being that kind of tall plant with kind of distinctive leaves and then that 4-petaled little white flower. It's really easy to pick out.
Yeah. And if you saw our promo image or the bumper for this show, I think the picture was of garlic mustard too, so people can see that.
And then if you're ever in doubt, you can just take a leaf and crush it up and smell it, and it really smells strongly of garlic. And so that's always a good test to do.
But it's easy to pull, right? So if a gardener sees garlic mustard in their landscape or their yard, what would you suggest that they do?
Just a little bit of it. You can just yank it right out of the ground. That's the nice part of it. It is, like I said, a biennial. And so those plants, biennials and annuals, tend to put more energy into their seed than the roots. So it just pops right out of the ground fairly easily.
And the key is that you do that before it goes to seed so that you're not dropping more seed, correct?
Yeah, even if it's like the stage that one I showed was in, it has a lot of seed in it, but as long as the seed pods aren't drying and splitting open, you can pull them. If you do that, stick them in a garbage bag, tie it up, and then leave it in the sun for a few days, and it'll cook those seeds and render them unviable. But you're right. If those seed pods are opening or it's starting to dry, just don't mess with it that year. All you're going to do is move it around.
Very
You
good.
definitely don't want to throw it on the compost heap.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. You've got one more, right?
I've got one more. Yeah. I got to do my show and tell. So this one is Japanese stiltgrass. And out of the three, this is probably the one that most people are not familiar with. It first showed up in Illinois in the 60s, I think, and been moving around since then. This one's really, really problematic in the southern third of the state, and then just spotty everywhere else. So I would definitely recommend people keep an eye out for this one. If you have low woods, it likes bottomland forest, moist woods. It is an annual, so it has very little roots. You can see here just tiny little root systems, but it produces a ton of seed on it, and it forms these big mats in our forest that just exclude everything else.
Interesting.
What do the flowers look like?
On stiltgrass?
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. It flowers pretty late in the season, so it's going to flower late August into September. And it's a pretty typical grass flower. It'll have 2 to 3 spikes. You don't really, it's hard to even notice them and separate them from that. The interesting thing about stiltgrass is it has 2 different kinds of flowers. It'll have open flowers that occur on the top of the plant. But if you dig down at the bottom of the plant, they have these little spurs that'll have closed flowers that self-fertilize, and they'll produce those seeds a lot earlier than the open flowers. And it's just a strategy, I think, to make sure that it has some level of seed production every year.
And again, because it's an annual, it's got to have that seed bank, or it's not going to be there next year. So yeah.
And you, I think, so us three are located in central Illinois. And Ryan, you said you were starting to see it around central Illinois. I don't know that I've noticed it a whole lot, but I might just not see it either.
Well, I think I've mostly started to see it here, I think, because I moved here in 2017. But before that, I lived in the heart of stiltgrass country down in southern Illinois. And I've probably told this story before. You've heard me tell it, Chris, but I just had a rude awakening at I think it was 2009 or 10. There was a stiltgrass summit at SIU that, Chris, I think you organized. Mm-hmm. And just a great educational event, a lot of researchers there, a lot of great information. But sitting there listening to those talks, I started to realize, oh my gosh, that plant is everywhere around my new house. It's in my yard. It's in my, and the more I looked around in my neck of the woods of southern Illinois, it was just everywhere. I lived along a stream in a stream valley. So it's kind of like the bush honeysuckle thing. When you start to notice it, it's just interesting to see this plant all around you. But I always try and tell folks, knowledge is empowerment. You now know what that plant is. You can control it on your property. You can teach your neighbors about it. You can take all these steps to do something about it, as opposed to just walk around oblivious to it all the time. So, but since I've moved to central Illinois, I've noticed it in a lot of places. And, I'm originally from here, so I visited here often, but I just maybe wasn't in natural areas as much, or just wasn't around as much. So yeah, I've really been surprised to see it up here, because I always thought of it as something in southern Illinois. So it's scary to see it kind of moving around the state. And I don't know, Chris, do you have any thoughts on, is it temperature that keeps it further south? Is it just the way it spreads, or? No,
I think, it was first found in the U.S. down in Tennessee, and it's really been spreading and expanding its range since then. So I really think the reason it's just now moving into central Illinois is probably more that it's just a time thing. It's slowly spreading its range. It's been in southern Illinois about 30 or 40 years now, and so it's moving that way. It does have little hard seeds. They spread with water, flood waters and things like that in short distances. But what we're finding is these long distance jumps. So from southern Illinois all the way up to an area in central Illinois, it's usually people related. It could be on your hiking shoes, or equipment, or mud on tires. It's something like that it's really helping this thing spread around.
So Chris, I think Candice and I would have a hard time identifying this plant. Or what are the key identification characteristics of it?
Sure. Let me get some more of it back here. So it is it's a little grass, so it'll be normally 2 to 3 feet tall later in the season. It's a warm season grass, so it grows more in the summer. But it really, one individual one almost looks like a little bamboo with short, fat blades on it. The blades, if you look close, will have a little shiny midrib sometimes. But the big thing is it's an annual, so it pulls out of the ground very easily. It has very weak root systems. Most of our other small grasses with short blades like this would be a perennial, and it would be you would try to tug on it and it wouldn't want to come out of the ground easily.
Okay, good tip. Yeah, because I think I'm sure I have probably seen it and I just haven't trained my eye to recognize it yet. So that's good.
Well, it does grow in these big patches. And so to me, if you see something like that looks out of place, looks a little different, or there's a dense stand of any kind of plant, it's worth looking at, because oftentimes that's how our invasives grow at much higher densities than the natives. And so keying in on that's a good way to look for something new.
Yeah, so you're really not going to see just one little stalk.
Yeah.
Ever growing. And I think for me, it was always the pull it out of the ground test. You know, if I saw something that looked about like the same vegetation that was about like stilt grass, I'd just go take a handful, pull it out. And if it came up easy, that's pretty much what you had in Southern Illinois. So,
yeah, that's a good tip. Well, awesome. Well, we've had some questions come in ahead of time that I think maybe we'll address. Some of them about invasives, some of them not. But if you guys have questions, feel free to add those in the chat box. If they're about invasives that Chris can handle, if there are any other gardening questions, feel free to start commenting with those. But we did get some ahead of time. One, we've kind of already talked about, is there any foolproof method of fighting and getting rid of garlic mustard? And we kind of talked about that easily pulling it is one strategy. Are there any other strategies that somebody might take for garlic mustard?
Yeah, I think pulling it out if you have small infestations, just a plant or two is useful. If you have acres of it, you can't work that much to do it, right? So a lot of times it's using herbicide, and so you can spray garlic mustard with something like glyphosate or triclopyr. And the nice thing about garlic mustard is, since it's a biennial, a lot of times it'll stay green in that first year rosette stage well into the fall into winter. And so you have a window of time there in the fall that plant's green, it's actively growing, and there's most of our native stuff has already senesced for the year. And so that gives you some level of selectivity and protection on your natives, so you're not going to impact them if you spray the garlic mustard at that time of year. You can also spray it in the spring, when it's starting to bolt and flower, and you just have to be a little more careful about overspray and impacting other plants.
Awesome. Yeah. And Amy just asked the same question. She said they can't possibly pull it all, so any other method. So that's great.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the same person also asked if we want to touch on some of these other ones quick. Also, how about buckthorn, non-native honeysuckle, and sumac? So some of the more woody species.
Yeah. With the woody species, we often do what's called a cut stump treatment. And so any woody species, if you just cut it down and walk away, the vast majority of them are just going to sprout right back. So that's usually not an effective method in and of itself. So you could cut it down, usually within a couple inches of the ground, and then you paint a little concentrated herbicide, and there's a bunch of different versions right on that cut surface, and that'll basically help kill the root system out of it and keep it from sprouting. Buckthorn, not so much, but honeysuckle, the bush honeysuckle, the nice thing about it is it's a pretty shallow rooted plant. The roots don't go down into a large taproot, they spread out, and that makes them fairly easy to hand pull themselves. You can even do, pretty good sized bushes. As long as you have a little bit of soil moisture, you can pop them right out of the ground as well. The other thing would be prescribed fire. If you manage your forest with that, it does a good job of helping to keep it in check. But you want to do kind of an integrated method of a lot of these different things.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think I've definitely found cut stump treatments to be just really effective. Probably my preferred method, but there's a little bit of detail to that. If you're going to do a cut stump treatment, you need to treat it pretty quickly after you cut it. Isn't that the common thinking?
It is, a plant that each plant has strategies for minimizing damage and protecting itself. And so if you damage those cells and you cut that plant, they're basically going to start compartmentalizing that damage as soon as they can and shutting those cells down. And so what we found is treating that plant within 10 to 15 minutes after cutting it, you'll have pretty good control. But if you wait a few hours, that translocation of the herbicide doesn't really happen, and you'll go down to 50, 60% success rate for sure. So that is important. And then timing of year is also important. This time of year is not the right time of year to control shrubs. They're actively growing, they're pushing the energy out of their roots, and so you don't get good translocation into the roots. Late summer, fall is a lot better. You typically have better control.
As far as getting that herbicide to travel to the roots and kill every root and really kill the plant.
Yeah, exactly.
Good tips. Okay. Now these next two ones kind of go back to the theory of, is it a weed, is it invasive, and a little bit more kind of garden focused. So Jean had a question, and I see another question from Gail here about violets. So are violets considered invasive? Also, what about a low-growing plant with leaves like a 4-leaf clover and deep yellow flowers? So what would you classify violets as invasive? And how about our 4-leaf clover yellow flowered plant?
Well, there's scores of violets out there, bunch of different species. The vast majority are native. I don't know of any violet species that I would classify as a true invasive in terms of causing some level of ecological damage. They can be, kind of weedy lawn species, but no, I wouldn't call them invasive.
Yeah, and Gail's
violets.
I have violets all through my lawn, and for me, that's great. It's green. It's green. It's good, and it is actually our state flower as well. So that's one thing.
I would be happy with a lawn full of violets.
Gail mentioned she has violets crowding out some newer plants in one of her landscape beds. So in that case, I probably would, if you don't want them there, you could take measures to pull those, would probably be my first strategy, because they pull fairly easily.
Yeah, that's what I've done. Just repeatedly hand pulled. I mean, avoid using a chemical. You don't harm other plants, I think, is the benefit.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And then how about that low-growing plant with 4-leaf clover leaves and deep yellow flowers?
That's probably going to be wood sorrel. So oxalis. There's a couple different species of it. There's actually some pretty rare native species, but they're probably talking about the European one. It's a little weed that grows in our yard. Mm-hmm. It's weedy and not really a problem, but that's probably what it is, would be wood sorrel.
Okay, very good. Great questions. Back to your honeysuckle talks. We got a question. Should I wait to try and treat honeysuckle until fall instead of cutting and treating this weekend like I had planned? So you kind of mentioned that, right?
Yeah, I think so. It depends on where you're at in the state. In Southern Illinois, we're at the point where we're just past flowering. So cut stumps are becoming effective. If you're in Northern Illinois, it might still be a little bit early yet.
Yeah. Okay.
I always kind of thought sometimes it's also just the mobilization of all your equipment and people and things and time and everything to get some control done. And so, maybe if you're just slightly outside of that perfect window, maybe this is just the only weekend you have everybody there and together, and it's, just do some control then. But just know that you may have to follow up a little bit. So I got that question a lot as a forester. For years, I was a forester in Southern Illinois, and that was kind of my answer a lot of times. It's like, hey, if you've got all the stuff in place, maybe you accept the fact that it's going to be a little less effective of a treatment, but I just always felt like it was better for folks to get something done out there. But again, for me personally, I try to focus my time and energy on the fall, like the late fall. And it's just a nice time when, like Chris talked about, there's kind of a window there where native stuff is dead or, has went dormant for the year. So closer to that time period is when I try to ideally focus it and just think with the thinking that plant is taking all its energy back down into its roots. It's going to take that chemical right with it and kill everything. And so, that's the most effective time for sure.
Yeah, I think so for most plants, for woody plants anyways. The nice benefit of that too, if you're working in the forest in the late fall, the ticks are not on there, poison ivy has lost its leaves. And so it's a lot more pleasant to be out there than say trying to do that in the middle of the summer.
Yeah, and temperature wise too. That was
mosquitoes, yeah. Good tips. Okay. I know we've had this question before. Jenny says, mint. I love mojitos, but hate mint. I'm infested and I cannot drink or cook enough lamb to keep up. So how do we control mint if she's got it established in her landscape? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I haven't done a lot with mint. You could maybe pull it. You could try to put a little really directed herbicide on it if you've got a big patch. But I deal mostly with in the forested setting. I don't deal a lot with that one. So I don't know if Kelly or Ryan does.
I would dig it up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would too. Try to dig out as much as you can and get as much of all the roots as you can, and then come back maybe with a targeted. If some still pop up after that, come back maybe with a targeted herbicide, painting or spray.
I know a mint patch can seem enormous, but relative to the scale that Chris probably deals with on acres and acres of forest land, we can invest that time and energy of digging and turning the soil and just mechanically getting it out of there. So that's how I've dealt with it, is just hand pulling and digging and just harassing it till it goes away. And it's tough.
Yep.
It's definitely a tough one.
And here's our PSA. If you're going to plant mint, either plant it in a container or plant it in a contained area that will keep it contained. Unless you want it to spread, that's perfectly fine. It will, but just so you know. Very good. Awesome. Great questions so far, everybody. Keep adding those to the comments. We've got an insect question that I'm sure Kelly can handle. Sue says she lives in Normal, Illinois. What's the best time to treat her arborvitae for bagworms? And she's got a particular brand of granules that she wants to use to kill the bagworm moth. So tell us about timing for bagworm treatment, Kelly.
Okay, so Erin's going to share a news release about bagworms. So the best time to start really thinking about bagworms is when the Japanese tree lilac blooms. Now, this image is not in full bloom. Usually it's this kind of white, cloudy, fluffy flower all over the trees on the edges. And that tells you that the bagworms the eggs are hatching and the caterpillars are starting to come out of the bags. And what they do is they climb to the top of the trees or the edges of the branches, and they produce a little piece of silk, and the silk, the wind carries the silk to new plants. If they don't go to an acceptable plant, they'll just do the process over again. So Japanese tree lilacs, when they bloom, that's the time to start scouting. The actual time that is the most efficient on treating with a pesticide would be 2 to 3 weeks after the Japanese tree lilacs are in bloom. I have in our home garden pest newsletter, you can use BTK, you can use spinosad, there's permethrins that can possibly work. But then after that timing, once these bags start, once the caterpillars start creating the bags again, at that point, chemical control is not effective. You have to go through and hand pick or, wait for the following year. Last year in my area, bagworms were really bad. Just, we probably had, a wet spring like we're having now and had lots of growth. So they were super happy. But yeah, and all those all those bagworms that are remaining on your plant right now are a dead female with hundreds of eggs inside of her. And that's how they overwinter. So that's my spiel on bagworms.
Very good. I know the common question we get is how to control them and when. So that's very good.
So would you pull off those bags now, or what would you do if you just noticed it today?
Well, it depends on the size of the tree. I love it when I tell homeowners to pick the bags off and they're like, it's a 20-foot tree, 30-foot tree. I'm like, yes, I get it. You're probably going to have to wait till the Japanese tree lilac blooms to do a spray because of the size of the tree. But I mean, if it were, a tree in my backyard, I would just pick them all off and I would do what Chris says. I'd put them in a black plastic bag. Otherwise, they're going to be crawling everywhere looking for a host. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Yeah,
I've actually found that kind of therapeutic, picking off bagworms in the late, towards the end of the season.
Yep.
Kids like to do it. It's a fun activity. They're easy to see if it's a short enough plant.
I like dissecting them to see where they are in their development.
Of course.
Never done that. I have to try that.
And
very
then,
good.
The previous year, even though Central Illinois, we had a lot, the Hort Educators went to Morton Arboretum and we did a little tour, and we went into a lab where they were counting bagworms, and they had said that the bagworms didn't fare very well in northern Illinois because of the cold winter. So that obviously did not help Central Illinois because we had bagworms everywhere last year.
And I imagine it'll be similar this year since we really didn't have too hard of a winter.
Right.
Yeah.
Temperature-wise, at least. Yeah.
And another really wet spring. I meant really wet. Is this wetter than normal? I meant really wet.
It's pretty wet. I haven't heard any stats, but I imagine it is more than normal. Yeah. Okay. Awesome questions. Keep those coming in the chat box. Oh, we have a question over on YouTube. Is that like the tent caterpillar? What's the difference there?
Well, they're completely different species.
How would you handle tent caterpillar versus?
Well, when it comes to tent, you can spray tent caterpillar too, but it's usually not as damaging as bagworms. What I like to do is to go open up the tents and allow in beneficial insects or birds to come and control the situation for me. Definitely you could, I don't know exactly the phonology for tent caterpillar right off my head. I can always look it up. But I just don't see tent caterpillars as much of a tree killer as bagworms can be. Not much of an issue unless it's like just completely covered. And, I've seen natural areas where tent caterpillars were crazy. But yeah, they stay inside those tents. They eat those leaves. The tents become bigger, and they usually in the crotch angle of the trees. I just go rip those open. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems like
caterpillars.
It seems like it's always just one or two on one plant that I get, and yeah, I've had pretty good luck just pull it apart as best you can. If you can't quite reach it, sometimes you can get enough water pressure with a hose to break up the tent. But yeah, same with me. I've never really seen it as a problem where it's going to kill a plant or just decimate anything. It's just kind of an eyesore.
Yeah, and even in the natural setting, that's the case. Tent caterpillars are defoliators. They usually don't defoliate the entire tree. And even if so, a tree can handle one or two defoliation events as long as it's not a chronic thing. It's more just aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
It's weird where they pop up. I noticed a bunch along the interstate, that there's just a little tiny trees that's came up in that edge of the interstate right away on the border of a crop field. And for some reason, that's just the perfect setting for them. I don't know why but like on some little box elders, they were just covering almost the whole canopy.
I noticed that too, driving down the interstate a lot of times. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we've got some more insect questions coming up here, Kelly, so get ready. A question here from Anna Jo. She said, every year my hostas get eaten up by something that makes lots of little holes in the leaves, and it's now starting up again. She said she doesn't see the pests. Any ideas on what and how to best treat?
Well, Candice, actually, that is a perfect question for you.
Yeah? Because I have lots of
hosta's biggest nemesis in the spring is slugs.
Slugs for sure. And I sure haven't noticed any in my garden yet. But I typically don't have a lot of slug problems, so I'm just kind of lucky. But yeah, slugs would definitely be my first inclination. Depending on the size of the holes. The other one that came to mind would possibly be earwigs. As well. They tend to have much smaller, kind of more minuscule holes in the leaves, and they are night dwellers, if I'm correct, right? So you're never going to see any of those either on your plants?
I see them in the flowers sometimes, but they're kind of hiding out.
Yeah, because like slugs, they also like to kind of hide in the mulch as well, if I remember right. So.
And that's really, kind of the secret is habitat change. Again, I just said we're having a really wet spring, but why are your hostas and the surrounding area staying so wet and being so hospitable to these insects? Maybe dividing or thinning out the hostas or moving some of the mulch out. While it's wet.
I tend not to put a lot of mulch around my hostas, so if any, almost just because of that reason. And once you get an established garden, by the time the hostas come up and fill the space, the ground is mostly covered, so you don't really need much of that additional mulch either.
Yeah, that's a great thing with hosta. They really block out the sunlight well. So.
Yep.
Have a huge weed issue, but isn't there a bunch of just not recommended or kind of hokey slug control practices? What are some of those? Like a glass of beer on the ground?
It's just an indication. It's going to tell you might have slugs, but it is not a control measure. Yeah. You're never, it's not like the 100 slugs are going to come and be in the beer can in the next day. Mm-hmm. It's just a really great way of you telling that you have it.
Well, and for earwigs, am I remembering correctly that you can put like a piece of cardboard on the ground too, and then kind of lift it up the next day and see if anything is kind of congregated under there?
Yeah, that's what we do with squash bugs. If you put down a board in your garden next to your squash plants, the squash bugs will go under the board, and you lift up the board in the morning and just start stomping, start squashing.
Same with, what's the technical name for roly-polies?
Bug?
Bill bug.
Yes, thank you. Like there's
I call them roly-polies.
I know there's another name.
Crustacean?
Same thing. So maybe try that, Anna. If you're not seeing the pest, maybe try that and see if you can trap something or be able to at least find out what you're dealing with. Okay, let's see. Japanese beetles. Question here. What can be done to the ground to get rid of Japanese beetles?
Great.
Want to adjust?
I am almost positive Chris can answer this question. Nope. Okay, so when it comes to Japanese beetles, it's the adults that cause all the damage. The larvae can cause damage to your turf if in very large numbers. So the point that really must be taken home is that you can treat the larvae as much as you want, and you're still going to get damage from adults because they're very good flyers. And Chris can treat in his yard, and I don't treat in my yard, and Japanese beetles are still going to get on Chris's apple trees or raspberry bushes. The secret to Japanese beetles is you have to get them when you first see them. And you have to prevent the damage. What I do is in the mornings, when you first see them, you knock them into a thing of soapy water because they're a bit lethargic before the sun starts really coming out and shining. And the same with the evening. And then I always pinch off the lacy foliage because the lacy foliage is leaving behind a feeding hormone that says, hey, everybody, come to this raspberry or rose bush and eat me some more. So if you are super diligent about hand picking and picking off lacy foliage in the first 2 to 3 weeks, you will have less of an issue the next 3 weeks because they will already have found other plants. Another thing is I do is if it attracts Japanese beetles, I'm not going to grow it. And I say that, and I'll grow basil. I always grow basil. I just cover it with, a row cover so they don't eat my basil. And, I'm fine with having a row cover over my basil. I don't have to look at the beautiful plant, even though it is very beautiful. The same with, you could cover roses, you could cover grapes, you could cover raspberries. I know it's at a time when they're flowering and you probably want some pollination. Another thing with Japanese beetle is if you do a systemic pesticide, which has been very popular in the past on Japanese beetle attacked plants, what you're doing is you're not only poisoning the Japanese beetles, but you're also poisoning all the pollinators that are going to visit that plant in the future. So I would refrain from systemic pesticides for adult Japanese beetle control.
Good tip.
Well, and maybe one of the nice
my elevator speech on Japanese beetle.
Get on your soapbox.
Well, and maybe one of the nice things is it's just not all it's not all summer. What did you say? It was 4 or 6 weeks that we were at it. So you just have to live through that and get on with your life. That's what I do. I really don't even control much. Not a lot of plants in my landscaping.
Same here.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
It goes back to Chris's point of, yes, it defoliates the trees, but it's not necessarily going to kill that tree. Yeah, multiple years of defoliation causes lots of stress on a tree. But, we seem to have these kind of cyclic actions. Like one year it's not so bad, but it's bad over here. The other year it's really bad over here, but not so bad over here. So I think people experience differences throughout the entire state throughout the different years.
Well, and just take a look at linden or basswood, for example. I mean, every year it's got the top third of every linden tree in Champaign-Urbana is just about defoliated, or has that lacy looking foliage. And, those trees are fine. They're healthy. I've looked at twig growth on them. I've tried to assess, there's one right across the road from my office building that I drive by, in a normal year every day. And it doesn't seem to even knock them back that much. By the time those beetles come out, those trees have probably got a return on the energy they invested in that leaf development. And so, maybe it's just a break-even thing for the tree. It's not necessarily gaining more energy that it could have from that foliage, but they seem to get by with it. I get that question a lot on shade trees that these beetles get on. What can I do about this? And honestly, it's just another one of those tree diseases that it's like you just need to kind of live with it, and it's going to show a little bit of damage. I guess the nice thing with basswood is that they start at the tip top and feed kind of down the tree. So a lot of times it's just that top like fourth or third of the tree that even has damage. So
yeah, we're seeing the same thing across the state now with anthracnose, on trees. So that's a wet spring. You're going to have a lot of anthracnose, and I get a lot of questions about it. But it's basically doing the same thing where it's defoliating or impacting those, and then it's you're going to get refoliation afterwards, and just the occasional event like that's really not going to kill those trees, and it's just a live with kind of thing.
So same with last year here, Chris. I'm sure you guys in Southern Illinois had a bad year for anthracnose too.
anytime you have a wet spring, there's a lot of moisture, you're going to have anthracnose. Different trees impact differently. Every year you're going to have anthracnose on sycamores. I mean, it just happens. But we saw a little more widespread last year because of the moisture.
Yeah, lots of species. Oaks, maples, definitely sycamore.
Yeah.
But yeah, I saw it on. I haven't seen it on oaks in a long time. Maybe I've just never noticed it. But I had some cases of that last year here.
Yep.
Very good. Okay, keep those questions coming. We've got about 15 minutes left. So if you have questions about invasives or anything garden related, we can address that today. Let me go back here. We had a question from Amy. She said, this incessant easterly wind has knocked down all of her iris. Should I cut them, put them in a vase? Do they make a good cut flower? Indeed, they do, Amy. They're not the longest lasting of cut flower, but they're definitely beautiful for those couple of days where you can get them in a vase. So yeah, unless you're gonna stake them back up and enjoy them in the garden, I would certainly cut them as a cut flower, give them a nice clean cut, put them in water with a flower food, and you should get some good enjoyment out of them. And if you're talking about iris, and normally if you're going to use it as a cut flower, you want to cut it at the stage where it's just starting to open. You don't want to wait till it's fully open, because then you're not going to get as much vase life out of it and they're easily damaged. But hey, if they fell over and you can't enjoy them, you might as well cut them and enjoy them inside anyway. So it's a great question. Okay, and with that, I think we are caught up on questions for the time being.
Candice, I have a few questions for Chris.
Okay, yes, let's do it.
Okay, Chris, my neighbor has a daylily patch and it is full of Canada thistle. What would you do if you don't necessarily love the daylilies?
Yeah, Canada thistle is an interesting one. Most of our thistles are biennials, so they have that same 2-year life cycle. Canada thistle is a little different. One, it's not from Canada; it just has that name. But two, it's a perennial and a rhizomatous plant, and that just means that it lives a long time. It has multiple flowering events, and then it'll spread through rhizomes. So it's a little more difficult to control than a lot of the other thistles. With the true biennial thistles, you just keep them from flowering and they're going to die, or you cut their flowers off when they go. With Canada thistle, you're going to want to control it, want to kill it, basically. I'd do some kind of herbicide treatment is one way. If it's a big patch, you can try to dig those rhizomes out if it's a small patch and you just really want to do that. Otherwise, it's going to be a little taller than your daylilies. You hit it when it's right before it's flowering, and you can just kind of wipe or apply right to the foliage, and you can kill it pretty easily that way. I would use something like a broadleaf specific herbicide, a 2,4-D or triclopyr, or something that's not going to impact monocots. So that'll help you there too.
Very good.
The big thing with Canada thistle is keeping it from going to seed. I mean, making sure you do anything before it flowers, because you don't want to spread it around any more than that.
Am I allowed to sneak into my neighbor's backyard and treat Canada thistle?
No comment, right?
What is an invasive species of plant that most people would be surprised is an invasive species?
Oh, that's a good question. The one that jumps to my mind would be actually the flowering pears. So everybody has, we call them Callery pear. That's the species, but you may know them by the cultivar names: Bradford pear, Cleveland pear. Super common. Many people have them in their yards. That one is spreading really rapidly across the state right now. It's being found not only in like roadsides and open areas, but actually in forest areas as well. So that's rapidly becoming one of our priority species.
Yes, and that is another testament to plant blindness. people will say, oh, I've never seen a Callery pear invasive. And I'm like, have you not looked? Because in the spring, you see white flowering trees everywhere.
Yeah. You've got 2 or 3 weeks in spring when it's in flower, it's so visible. Once it loses those flowers and it leaves out, it just becomes another tree by the road and you just don't see them. Mm-hmm. You know, that one's an interesting one where it kind of behaved for many years. It didn't spread. It didn't really become a problem. And the story behind it's kind of interesting. It's that species is an outcrosser. It has to cross with another individual. But the cultivars are all asexually propagated, right? They're all through stem cuttings. So a Bradford cultivar is unable to pollinate another Bradford cultivar. It only was when we had all these newer cultivars planted on the landscape that there was enough genetic diversity in the ornamentals that we started seeing spread of this species.
And not to knock it too much, but from an arborist perspective, it's a terrible tree too, because it has really narrow branch angles. And in the first windstorm, it peels apart like a banana. And then you have this gone tree. So, I mean, I understand why folks like that flowering display. It's like a month of flowering in the spring. And, you know, I understand the ornamental values, but there's a lot of reasons other than invasiveness that it has problems with girdling roots. You know, it's just one of those plants that we need to move on from in the landscaping world.
Yeah. And it stinks, I think, when it is flowering.
And I can't think of the program name offhand, but it was either Missouri or Wisconsin or Michigan, where they actually send you a gift certificate if you send them a picture of you cutting down your ornamental pear.
Nice.
Yeah, Missouri did that. I think South Carolina did that. There's a bunch of states that, that are now recognizing it as an invasive and taking steps to work on it.
So if I have one growing in my yard, would you recommend me taking it down?
Yeah, that's a tough call. I would definitely recommend you taking it down if you're doing any kind of changes. I think if you've invested a lot of money and time, I'm not going to tell you have to cut it down. But I think anytime you're making choices for landscaping and what you put in your yard, you should consider invasiveness as one of those and kind of stay away from those known invaders that are still available to plant. The Callery pears, the burning bushes, some of those.
Mm-hmm. We had a question about how to identify flowering pear. Do you want to give some kind of basic ID? Yeah.
So it can be a little tricky because the ornamental versions, the cultivars, look actually a lot different than when it escapes. So these pears are, they've got simple leaves that are the kind of dark glossy green. They flower typically before they leaf out, so you'll have a lot of flowers in the spring. When they escape, the leaves actually get a little smaller, and then they often grow these big woody thorns on them. So very spiny. The fruit are a little round, hard fruit, about the size of a marble, and they're going to be kind of tannish or greenish tan in color. But you really want to see that glossy, simple leaf. It looks a little like a plum leaf or something like that. It'll turn purple or bright red in the fall.
Very good. In the landscape, I tend to also notice the habit, the shape of it a lot too. It has a very conical, pyramidal kind of shape to the tree too.
Yeah, it loses that when it escapes. So
when
it escapes, it becomes kind of a multi-stemmed, shrubby, thorny thing. But yeah, when it's an ornamental, it's very obvious.
And I know you can't see this right now, but don't they have these big kind of woolly buds?
They do, yeah. So the winter buds, the terminal buds, so the ones at the end of the stems are kind of real fuzzy, real woolly. You can pick those out pretty easily too.
Well, and we've got a comment here from Eileen. She says there's a no man's land behind her house that the city doesn't claim, but it belongs to them with pear all over it. She asked, can I do anything to control that?
If it's on somebody else's land, I think you need to have permission, obviously, or gain their support. But if you do have permission to control it, fortunately, they're pretty easy to control. If there are a bunch of small ones, you can mow them down and then spray the resprouts. If they're bigger, you can do a cut stump like we talked about and treat it with a more concentrated herbicide. We found that a bunch of different things you can use to control it. It's just a matter of, it's such a heavy seed producer. It's such a quick spreader. It's a matter of just staying ahead of that spread and just keeping at it. You're just going to have to repeat treatments. On my own land down here in Southern Illinois, I have more problems with Callery pear than I have with honeysuckle, multiflora rose, autumn olive, any of those. I have more Callery pears on my land kind of causing problems.
Wow. Okay, well, we have 5 minutes left. So if anybody has any final questions, add those to the comment box. I do want to note quick before we end, we've recently started a new Facebook group over on Facebook. It's called the Illinois Extension Horticulture Group, and Aaron added it to the comments there for us. So if you do have questions or things you want to share that come up between these live shows, you can join that Facebook group, and we're all on there to answer questions and share feedback. So that is going to be, I think, a really great way for people to ask questions and share just great gardening stuff that's going on. So definitely check that out if you're not in there already. And Chris, I think you mentioned earlier you had a management guide that covers a lot of this. Do you want to maybe share about that again?
Sure. Yeah. So Extension, we put together with cooperation from Southern Illinois University and the Morton Arboretum. I've got a copy here. A management guide for invasive plants and forest pests of Illinois. So this covers about 40 some different species of plants and then a handful of different invasive pests. And it's about, the management practices you can do. The neat thing is that we had a lot of volunteers collect data across the state. We actually have this phenology calendar for all the plants. And it goes into like when you can expect them to flower, when they can set seed. So it helps you refine your control timing for your techniques. That one is available. We have, I think we're going to put a link up in the comments. But it's also, we have printed versions that are in most local extension offices and available. So I'd highly recommend that as just a resource to keep with you.
Yeah, it's super handy.
It is so handy. I've used it so much. I'll make a decision and I'll have people go, whoa. And I'm like, but that's not what Chris says.
Read the guide.
We have to read the guide.
And that's, with any science, that's an evolving science. What we thought was the best method 4 years ago isn't necessarily the best method now. So keeping up to date on those things is important to save yourself money and make the most out of your efforts.
Very good.
Absolutely.
Okay, we're going to finish it off with one final question that came through. One we hear a lot. She says her neighbor planted creeping Charlie, which maybe or not. Now it's all over her yard. What should I do?
Candice, you scoff, but I've actually seen creeping Charlie for sale in a garden center before.
Wow.
I took a picture.
You should, because that's crazy.
I feel bad for whoever bought that.
Yeah.
Wow.
I personally don't mind creeping Charlie.
I don't mind it in the lawn. I let it go because like my lawn, if it's green, it's good. But if I do get it it creeps into landscape beds. Usually my first strategy is to try to pull out as much as possible. And then after that, if I need to come to some type of herbicide strategy, I will. But for me, usually if you stay on top of pulling it frequently, that tends to work fairly well.
Well, it's amazing to me, and you probably don't have it this bad, Candice, but how it can creep across the top of the mulch. Like its roots are just like in the mulch or something. I don't get how it does that, but I kind of let it ignore it in places that are not mulched or landscape beds and try to control it in those areas. But it's a tough one. It is a really tough one.
And if it's growing within your lawn and lawn is your ideal plant, then you need to increase the health of the grass rather than trying to attack the weed. You need to think about, well, Do I have compacted soil? Do I have nutrition in my soil? Am I feeding my lawn? That's a lot. A lot of that has to do with weed management, and also not mowing too low, mowing a little bit higher, to prevent that weed from taking over.
Yeah, that's what I've seen is just people mow their lawn too often or mow it too low, and that just adds that disturbance. So a pretty healthy, vigorous turf does a decent job of keeping it out. You'll never get rid of it.
Yeah. Okay, that is a great one to finish on because it's a very popular question. So our next show is going to be on June 3rd. So I hope you all will join us again on our Facebook Live show. And like I mentioned, check out that Facebook group if you have things you want to ask about in the meantime. We're all going to be over there. I want to give a big thanks to Chris for joining us today. He is definitely a wealth of information. Anytime I have a ID question and it's not some landscape plant that I know, he always knows what it is and is always super helpful. So thank you, Chris, for joining us. We appreciate it. And we will see you all next time on June 3rd. Happy gardening, everybody.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you all. It was fun.